My name is Christopher Anderson. I teach political science at Wilfrid Laurier University. Most of my research is Canadian in orientation, historical, quite often immigration, refugees, and citizenship, or sort of the broad scope. And I'm often very interested in sort of the way in which the liberalness of that state, and Canada in particular, is sort of informed and sort of changed over time in terms of how we respond to or how we think about questions of migration, citizenship, belonging, immigration, and particularly refugees and asylum seekers. Today, the focus of my talk was on Catherine Verne's book. In particular, I wanted to sort of think a lot about this question of the settler society and sort of how we can kind of conceptualize the settler society, how we use it as an analytical tool in order to sort of understand, for me, mostly the idea of the past and the present. So, to what degree can we understand the global migration sort of regulation as it occurs today by understanding the nature of the settler society and how it's influenced that regulation? But as well, to what degree have we sort of moved beyond the settler society into sort of what she talks about as the new politics of immigration? So what I want to do is just sort of think about whether the patterns that we see today, whether or not we can see them in the past as well. And if we can, then what's that say about the newness of them, or whether there's still some of the things that happened in the past that continue along with us. And so it's a different kind of relationship between new and old rather than a more sort of a sharper break between the past and the present. And therefore, how we move ahead to the future. Sure. I mean, again, I think this the idea of the settler society. There's lots of different things we can do with it, and so I guess I began to think in the Canadian context, there was a lot which could be thought of as the end of the settler society that I don't necessarily think is still an end. In part, the ending is not a sort of preordained end that sort of is mapped onto sort of empirical reality. The ending is in part how we choose to interpret sort of what's going on, and so I think a case can be made, and Catherine's making it about that the end of the settler society is here, and you can sort of find that sort of narrative in there. But another narrative can actually say the settler society continues, and in fact, if part of what we're doing is try to find ways to sort of to smooth that transition between sort of otherness and migration into sort of communities, then the settler society is often sort of been deemed to be one of the sort of societies or states out there that are receiving migrants in various ways, seem to have thought more about this and sort of tried in a number of ways to sort of adapt. And so if we call this is at the end, then that whole set of potential toolkits is left at the side, and therefore we have to create something totally, utterly different and new. Part of the argument could be that actually there are elements of that we could still continue to improve, to adjust, and therefore that, in a sense, to do that at that point is sort of using it politically in order to say there's a set of goals and objectives associated with the settler society, not simply a set of sort of policies and practices. But there's an end point, and if you sort of continue to try to utilize that term, you might be able to find ways to get at some of the stuff I think that we're all agreeing we want to get at. Sort of something that sort of has more space for questions of human rights and human dignity in terms of how migrants sort of are resettle in different parts of the world and the opportunities to do so. So the extent to which settler societies have always done that, if we still think migration is occurring, that seems that to me is sort of useful to continue to utilize that as one of the tools in the toolkit in order to think about how we can do that better in the future. All sorts of reasons. I mean, a lot of them really come out clearly in Catherine's book. Is just simply that it is a constantly very human and compelling set of circumstances, and it's compelling economically, politically, socially, and very sort of human levels. And we see it either in something dramatic like a refugee movement, or the separation of the children down in the United States, but even our own separation of children with detention. I mean, you cannot go far in the world news without finding questions that relate to international migration and sort of questions of resettlement and how people respond to people on their doorstep, or people would like to be on the doorstep, or people within that whole range, right? So I think it sort of taps into some very, very fundamental sort of questions we have about community, both in terms of what kinds of communities we think we want, but also what do we aspire to be, and what kind of values do we want to embed within that. Migration sort of always sort of challenges us to think through that again and again over time historically, and I think it continues to do so today. So in that sense, we sort of, it's one of those classic, you ignore it at your peril, because we know the negative consequences that come along with not thinking enough, and not thinking enough about how to respond and think about the nature of migration. So it behoves us to kind of move in the other direction, kind of think, and give it more sort of concrete consideration.